Welcome to AMP2, 142 by 142. I'm Dr. Deb, and I'm going to produce a series of podcasts that will review lecture material for you. Hopefully you'll like these. First of all, if you're in a face-to-face class, I will be giving you lecture notes for every system. We will cover 7 systems, and generally they're color-coded because I like to do things that way. It's more efficient and you can find them faster. So anyway, you'll get 2 green sheets for the lecture notes. One will be on the general functions for the system and a little explanation. And then on the back will be primary organs. These are the organs that do the major functions for the system. And then secondary organs are listed. These are organs that help the primary, but they're not necessarily necessary for the system. So like the first one, teeth. Do you really need teeth for digestion? Absolutely not. You're not born with them, and you're not going to die with them for the most part, unless they're false teeth. And so I'm just saying, so it's nice to have them, but can you do digestion? Sure you can, because the number 1 function for digestion is to break down all your food items into their smallest chemical parts, which means the elements. And so off that periodic table of elements on the wall in our lecture halls, basically, how many foods do you really need to stay alive? How many elements made out of that table? Only between 30 and 40. I would say 35. I split the difference. I say 35 elements make up almost all of your food items. They've got to come in and keep you alive. And where are they all broken down? In the mitochondria, right? The mitochondria is going to use enzymes, oxygen and ATP to break down your food items. So anyway, that's the function for the digestive system. That's its number 1 function. And then it also does some other things that we'll talk about a little bit later as we go along. All right, and so anyway, that's your first sheet. And then the second sheet that will be posted on Moodle is the metabolism sheet. And the metabolism sheet generally reviews some basic chemistry items from your basic course, your prereq course, Bio 101. And then it also gives you some new information on vitamins that you've never had. And yes, you have to know the names of the vitamins, their chemical name and their common name, which is like vitamin A, but its real name is retinol. And so yes, you will have to know those, and I will do a separate podcast on metabolism, okay? All right, so that's the first order of business. Then the second thing you'll get immediately from me in class will be a yellow sheet and a gold sheet. And these are your hormone sheets. This is essentially your final exam, part of your final exam for the endocrine system, knowing all the hormones. Why? Because basically a lot of things that go wrong in the human body are hormone-based. They're not working right, you don't make enough, or you make too much, and it brings on disorders which can lead to diseases. So basically you'll have a yellow sheet, and it's called primary hormones. And the primary hormone endocrine organs, these are the ones that all they do is make hormones. They have no other job except to make hormones. The gold sheet are secondary endocrine organs. That means they have other functions first, and then, by the way, they also make hormones, okay? So it's a secondary function. It's not their number 1 job. So the number 1 job of the pancreas is not to produce insulin, which most people must think, oh my gosh, it is. No, it is not. It's to make enzymes for carbohydrate digestion and the duodenum of the small intestine. And so, and then by the way, they also make insulin if your blood chemistry isn't correct for carbohydrates, specifically glucose. And so that's where that comes into play. But the number 1 job of the panc is not making insulin. All right, so then as we go along the semester, I will always tell you which hormones are going to fit with which system. And so we will cover most of these by the time we get to the final. And all your exams are not cumulative, but we're going to reuse a lot of the same material, the histology, the tissues, the organs, and the hormones. And so it sort of all blends together eventually. All right, so now the first thing I like to do is always tell you which hormones are going to be on the first test. And so the first lecture test and lab test could have little questions about the hormones. Basically, are going to be from the digestive and urinary system. That's our first exam material. And so I'll go to the gold sheet first. And on one side of the gold sheet are basically most of the digestive hormones and urinary for test 1. And so you've got to do the pancreas and all their hormones, and I'll be talking about those later when we get there. The liver makes a hormone. A stomach makes 5 of them. We've got the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, makes 3. Then we go down to fat pads, and they make leptin. And then we go down to the kidney, and it's going to make 2 hormones to regulate blood pressure. All right, so that's it for the gold sheet for test 1. And then we have the primary hormones, the yellow sheet. And so on this one, we want to go find the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, and underneath the pituitary gland, there is TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And we want that one because it's going to go from the pituitary gland to your thyroid to speed up your metabolism, right? To make the hormones there to release a couple other hormones. And then on the back, we want to go and we want to get under the pituitary gland ADH, which is called antidiuretic hormone, called vasopressin in the medical world. And that's going to save you from low blood pressure, supposedly. All right, so then we go down to the thyroid gland, and it's going to make 3 hormones. 2 of them to control every mitochondria in the human body, which breaks down your foods with food. The food will also then take on enzymes and oxygen and ATP inside of the mitochondria, and it will break down your food quickly. So thyroxine is T4, T3 is triiodothyronine, and then we have calcitonin, which is going to lower your blood calcium levels. So all 3 from the thyroid gland should be checked off. And then we go down to the parathyroid gland. So if the calcitonin lowers blood calcium, then we want the parathyroid that's going to increase blood calcium. So just drop down 1 more. And then we go to the adrenal gland. And what hormone do we want down here? We want cortisol, the good old stress hormone that basically promotes carbohydrate synthesis, which means synthesis means to build something up, and so that's going to make you fat. It makes you crave carbs when you're under stress, and that's when you're going to release this wonderful hormone. All right, and then is there another adrenal gland hormone? Yep. You just go right underneath it, and it's ALD, called aldosterone, and that's going to help regulate blood pressure when we get to the urinary system, okay? So those are the official hormones for test 1, right? And they will definitely show up on your lecture test, believe me. All right, so now what are we going to do? So these podcasts are aimed to help you understand the material on my notes. And what I do all semester, I draw all the organs, my version of them. They're really bad, but students like them. And then I explain how they're built because their basic anatomy determines what they can do. And there is a term or a saying in A&P, structure determines function. So you have to know how something's built to understand what it can do and its limits to what it can do. So basically, I've drawn these on the board to make it a little bit faster. Otherwise, it would take hours to do all this, and you wouldn't want to sit around for hours and watch my podcasts. And so I also have lab podcasts and pictures posted for all the lab activities, except for food analysis. Our first review lab is food analysis that you did in Bio 101, and I do not have anything on that, nor will I. There's just a sheet in your lab pack that you should have bought, and basically then that reviews it, and it'll probably come back to you pretty quickly. All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to do the upper digestive tract. The upper digestive tract, which means we are going to start with the oral cavity, And so I'll explain how the oral cavity is put together. And all of this, a lot of this is on your lecture note sheet. Some of it is not. I will also post a drawing of this exact picture on Moodle for you also, or else you can just stop the video of the podcast and shoot pictures off the screen, however you want to do it. All these pictures are also found in here in the lab book. And so I do have a sheet of official pictures that you have to learn eventually. And all the terms I use on my podcasts and on my drawings, those are the only ones I'm concerned with, okay? So you don't have to worry about all these other terms on these pictures. And some of the pictures in the lab book are actually labeled incorrectly. And so there you go. So that's an overview of what we're going to do this semester. And so now we're going to start with the upper digestive tract, or the upper GI tract right here. And so the upper GI tract essentially stands for gastrointestinal tract. And gastro really stands for what? It actually means stomach, and intestines is intestines, small and large. And so basically upper GI tract. And so they have another name for it. It's called alimentary canal, and that would include the oral cavity. But basically, when you go in medicine, medical people say, oh, you're going to have an upper GI series. And the upper GI means from the oral cavity down to the stomach, right? So that's an oral, from the oral cavity to the stomach would be an upper GI series, right? All right, so now basically we're going to trace where food goes and what happens to the food as it enters your mouth, okay? So we'll take brown and we'll put a piece of chocolate between your lips. So here's a Snicker bar, a Snickers. Okay, a piece of candy. And basically, this is the first organ that is going to touch your food, okay? And so the first organ in the digestive system is actually your lips. And lips is a common term, and we do not write common terms on our exams. And so our lab test will be 25 fill in the blank, no word banks. The word bank is in your brain. And so basically, you're not counted off for spelling, but spell as close as possible. And so anyway, you always want to use the big word for the terms, because these are the ones that you're going to have to type in your medical records when you see patients. All right, so anyway, labia oris is the name for lips, and there's a superior labia oris and an inferior labia oris, okay? And what do the lips do? Basically, they just grab the food, they're going to grab the food, and then they're going to push it into the oral cavity, which means the space in your mouth, right? And so that's what your lips do. That's the digestive function for lips, all right? And so do lips have other functions? Sure they do. They help you talk, etc. But talking in that is associated with the respiratory system. So I just want digestive function. So they're going to basically push the food into the oral cavity, and then when your lips come together, they keep the food in the oral cavity instead of letting it slime down onto your chin and down in the front of your body. And so basically, they're going to close and keep the food in the oral cavity. So that's all the lips do for the digestive system. Now, what are your lips made out of? They're actually made out of skin, right? And so everything in purple on the board is stratified squamous ET. It is your thin skin. It's covered with thin skin. So your lips could technically grow hairs, but they do not, because they're moving all the time. And if hairs were genetically programmed for that, they would be popping out, and they can occasionally pop out of your lips. You can have hairy lips. All right, so basically right here, this is the superior and inferior labia oris. All right, they're going to push the Snickers bar into the oral cavity. And the cavity means space around the organs. And so here is our Snicker bar. And so here's the Snicker. Okay, great. And now it's in the oral cavity. And we are going to talk about the tongue in a separate drawing. But the tongue will take the food item, and basically the tongue's going to push it back eventually, and then you're going to swallow it. So the Snickers will be on your tongue, and the tongue has several different functions, like gripping the food and moving it around to get crushed and torn apart and cut by your teeth. And so here are your teeth, and your teeth are actually made out of bone CT. And we will be talking about teeth in a separate video. Bone CT is what teeth are made out of, right? All right, so they are not covered with skin, no. And so what you see is the enamel, and that's bone CT. So, but you do have two bones that have the teeth in them. And so the maxillary bone and the mandible, right there. And so basically these are bones, you know that from A&P1, and it's covered with skin. And so the purple is stratified squamous, ET, and that's called the gingiva, okay? The gingiva is your gums, and it covers the bones that have the teeth in them. There's also a second bone up here on top, and it's called the palatine bone. And the palatine bone, along with the maxillary bone, these two bones together, right here and right here, are called the hard palate. The hard palate, right here, a hard palate. And so the hard palate basically helps crush and chew the food. When the food comes up here, it will then get crushed against this bone, moved around, back to the tongue, and then eventually it'll go down the tube. Right, so the hard palate is for crushing the food, and basically the hard palate also has usually some skin on it that's going to go like this, right there, the hard palate. And so it has some ridges, skin ridges on it. Skin ridges, right there. And in the cat, when we see that in the lab, you will definitely see those skin ridges because they even have spines on them to really hold on to the live food that they eat. But anyway, the skin ridges are called the raphe, right here. So the hard palate is going to have a raphe made out of very, very, very hardened thin skin. And so the gingiva is thin skin. It's the same as what's on your arm, right there. All right, so now that's what the hard palate does. And then we'll talk about teeth individually and how they're made in another podcast. All right, so now we have the tongue, and the tongue is anchored to the hyoid bone, which I don't have on this picture. But underneath your tongue, you're going to notice there is a special piece of skin underneath there, and it's made out of stratified squamous, STSQ, ET, and it's got some dense reg CT. Dense reg CT right here, dense reg CT. And there's also another one here holding your lips close to the bones. And so these are called a frenulum. A frenulum. And so this structure right here is called lingual frenulum. And so basically the lingual frenulum keeps your tongue upright, and so that you don't swallow your tongue either, and it goes back down your throat. And so it's called the lingual frenulum, keeps it upright, and basically some people have a very long lingual frenulum that stretches too far, and actually their tongue, when they chew, they will bite their tongue when they chew a lot, and they have to have that clipped and shortened so they don't keep biting their tongue. All right, and so what do we call this frenulum? This piece of skin and dense reg CT that's going to hold your lips next to the bones, that is called labial frenulum, superior and inferior. So it's the same thing right here. So we just say labial frenulum. And that's just going to keep the lips close to the bones so that it can really close your oral cavity tightly so that nothing will come out, right? Also, you'll notice in babies, because a lot of their food goes down their chin all the time, that just has to do with the orbicularis oris muscle around the lips. It's not well developed yet either, and the sucking action with the milk helps with that. And basically, as that gets more toned, that muscle develops and gets more toned, then the baby will be able to control how much food is going to stay in the oral cavity versus getting pushed out and down onto the chin and then down wherever, right? All right, so now, basically, we've got the teeth that are basically going to chew, crush the food item. And then we've got the tongue that's going to move the food item around to the teeth to get crushed onto the hard palate. And then we're going to get back here. We're going to go back here. And all of a sudden you see in the back of your oral cavity, you see a flap of skin there. Now a lot of times, sometimes that's gone. If they've removed your tonsils, basically, sometimes this is removed when they remove your tonsils that are sitting up underneath the skin on both sides. And so that is called the famous uvula. It's a flap of skin that has no function. No function. It's like a landmark because basically when you see your uvula, then you know you were going into your throat area, the throat. And so what you call your throat really has a technical name right here. And the technical name for your throat is oropharynx, the oropharynx. So this is the oropharynx area where I have orange stars right here. And how do we know that? If you don't have a uvula, then the next thing you have is the skin gets real soft back here because there's cartilage underneath. There's going to be hyaline and elastic cartilage underneath. And so that is called your soft palate. So wherever you see the uvula indicates that the soft palate is right above it, superior to it. And so that's going to help with the process of swallowing, okay? All right, so we've got the hard palate made out of bone, and then we've got the soft palate made out of hyaline and elastic cartilage. All right, and so this area, this is no longer the oral cavity. Oral cavity is only this part in front of the uvula. And once it's behind the uvula, then we call this area, this space, this lumen, central space here, this lumen represents the oropharynx, which is your throat. All right, then we go down, and the food item is going to continue down this track. It's going to go laryngopharynx, which is also all of it's lined with stratified squamous ET, and then it's got the esophagus, the food tube. That's what they nicknamed the food tube, and the esophagus goes down to the stomach, okay? All right, so now, basically, we need to talk about how does the food get swallowed? How do your food items and your liquids all get swallowed? Well, there's a process, and so this Snicker will come back here, okay? Come back here on the back of the tongue right here. The Snicker, there's our food item, and the tongue is going to actually lift it. When you get solid food back here, the tongue lifts it, and it hits the soft palate. So think of the soft palate like a trampoline. So it gets lifted up here, and then the food is going to drop and go down this way, and eventually it ends up in the stomach, right? And so that is the process called deglutition. Deglutition, which means swallowing. Right there, deglutition, which means swallowing. So the act of swallowing is actually under a cranial nerve control and that would be number 10, the vagus, right? So that's going to help you swallow, deglutition. All right, so the tongue initiates your swallowing. It's got to push it up against the soft palate, and then it shoots it right down the tube. Now, sometimes you get a food item or some liquid, oops, it sort of gets caught right here in another opening, right here. There's a split in the road, and right here there's a little flap right here, a cartilage flap, and that is like a little lid, a sewer lid, and that's called your epiglottis. That thing, when you start swallowing, this thing flips over and it will cover the lumen, the opening to the larynx, which is your voice box right here. And so basically, this should flip over when you start to swallow because it's coordinated that way with the nerve innervation. And so anyway, the epiglottis will flip over, and then, but if the food goes down here, you're gonna start to choke. That's where your choking occurs, right in here, and that thing can just drop right straight on down, and then you've got a real problem when your snicker is blocking your airway, which is your trachea, absolutely. So anyway, so that sits basically superior to the esophagus and the laryngopharynx. So this is how we get the name laryngopharynx, because this is called the larynx. So this part of the tube right here is called laryngopharynx. And then trachea, when you get to the trachea right here, then wherever the trachea starts, then you go over to the tube that's behind it, inferior to it, and so that's going to be the esophagus, right? Okay, the esophagus, and so that's how you differentiate between the different areas of the food tube. All right, so anyway, that's how food's going to go down. How long is your esophagus? A typical esophagus in an adult equals about 1 foot long, right? 1 foot long, going down. And its nickname, the esophagus nickname, is also food tube, right? Food tube. That would be its common name, food tube. So don't ever write that on a test because you won't get any points for it. You can write it, but smiley face will be after it. Sorry, you gotta have the official name. All right, so now, basically, let's go back. What else gets added to the food? So in the oral cavity, you mainly have mechanical digestion occurring. Mechanical digestion means that you're going to use structures to rip, tear, and crush the food, all right? So this is the area for mechanical digestion with the teeth, with the hard palate, essentially. That is going to do the part of mechanical digestion. Also in the oral cavity, we have salivary glands, which are going to start chemical digestion, okay, chemical digestion. And so they're going to make saliva, okay, saliva. And so we have 3 sets of salivary glands on the right side of the face and on the left side. And so here are the 3 salivary glands. The one that sits up by and right on both sides of the uvula, basically that's called the parotid gland. Parotid gland, and it makes a serous secretion, which I'll review what that is in a minute. So that's the parotid salivary gland. It's the largest and makes most of your mucus. Then the second largest one is in front of the mandible, and if you lift your tongue, sometimes you can see 2 lumens, openings to the tubes, the ducts right here. And so this one is called sublingual because it's below the tongue, or submaxillary. And so this has a duct and an adenomere, and this one actually makes mucus. Mucus is mucus, no matter where it's found, it's always made out of the same thing. And so basically, the mucus in your nose matches this mucus, right? So mucus is going to get added to your saliva, all right? And then basically right here, we have a submandibular salivary gland, submandibular, and it's called a mixed gland because it's 50% serous and 50% mucus that's going to get added to your food items in the oral cavity. So you have 3 sets, so a total of 6 salivary glands, right? All right, so now also, what cranial nerve is going to control the release of saliva? Well, over here we have cranial nerve number 7, which is your facial nerve, and that's going to control all your salivary glands. So a real quick review on glands, exocrine glands that are going to produce a secretion that goes outside the body or into a cavity, a body space. And so all exocrine glands always have to have a duct, and then they have the adenomere. Remember the adenomere? And the adenomere for salivary glands is simple QBT, and they're going to make the saliva, and then it's going to go up the duct and then out. And so your duct is like a straw, okay? The duct is like a straw that will be taking it up and out into a body cavity or a body surface. Great. All right, so then what actually makes this get squeezed out? Well, we have to have some myoepithelial cells. You have to have some smooth muscle around the adenomere, SMT, smooth muscle, and that's going to squeeze it to push the saliva up and out. It just doesn't magically run out of there. It's got to be squeezed out of this like a water balloon right here. So it'd be like taking your hand around a water balloon and squeezing it. So you gotta have that muscle action, smooth muscle, involuntary control. All right, so the facial nerve basically controls the release of saliva from all 3 sets of salivary glands. And basically your saliva in general is a pH of 5. So it's slightly acidic, okay? And so a serous secretion means it's 80% water and 20% enzymes, okay, to break down your food items, to start food breakdown. And mucus is just the opposite. It has less water, 20% water, and 80% glycoproteins. And the protein part is the enzymes. Remember, every enzyme is made out of protein, okay? And then the glyco, G-L-Y-C-O, always stands for starch, which is a huge sugar. GLU always stands for glucose, which is blood sugar. Don't ever forget that. That's on your boards. Always. There's a question on glyco versus gluco. All right. So anyway, so that's what your mucus is made out of. And how much mucus do you make per day? Oh, well, it depends. You make about 1 pint per day, actually. But it depends. If you work in some place that smells really good, maybe you're going to salivate more, okay? And so you can make a lot more than 1 pint a day, but that's the average for an adult, right? All right, so those are all our structures and what they do for the upper GI tract. And so the only one I'm missing is the stomach, which I'll do on a separate picture, because then the stomach will be down here, right here at the end of the esophagus, and then it continues on down, so stomach. Okay, so we'll do that in a separate picture. All right, so that's the end of the oral cavity, the upper GI tract.